The world has just crossed another red line, and this time it's one of those that has no return. Ukraine, which until a few months ago was prohibited from launching attacks on Russian territory, now has full authorization to do what it well understands, even reaching Moscow. That's right, Moscow. In a historic decision, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States officially suspended all range restrictions of long-range weapons provided to Ukraine. Now the missiles that could only fly to the border have a green light to cross it. The message is straightforward. The game has changed, and changed to real. The decision was announced by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz in an unzipped tone. According to him, long-range weapons sent by Western allies can now be used without any range limitation. Ukraine is officially released to attack within Russia. The reason? A climb caused by Moscow. In recent weeks, Russia has launched the biggest drone attack since the beginning of the war. There were hundreds of Shahid drones and other models, reaching critical infrastructures, power plants, military deposits, and even civil zones in Ukraine. Moscow's message was clear: we still have firepower and let's use it. But the West decided to respond in the same coin. So far, Ukraine faced a kind of invisible current. As much as I had received modern missiles like Storm Shadow and ATACMS, there was always a limit: not attacking Russian soil. The idea was to avoid an uncontrolled climb, or worse, a direct war between NATO and Russia. But the massive attack of Russian drones has changed everything. At emergency meetings held in Berlin, London, and Washington, it was decided: containment failed. Ukraine now needs a strategic depth. In other words, the ability to strike military targets within Russia before these attacks reach the Ukrainian territory. And that's when the first practical signs of the new policy began to emerge. The United Kingdom and France allowed Ukraine to start using the dreaded Storm Shadow missile, with range between 250 and 560 kilometers. A real nightmare for the Russian military. Ammunition screwings, command centers, and our bases in regions such as Crimea and Donetsk became priority targets. Rather, these places were considered out of reach. Now, they are no longer. A change that caught Moscow by surprise. And don't stop there. The United States, which until then kept the sending of the ATACMS missiles, have now opened the game. Ukraine has had these missiles since 2023 and 2024, and now it can also use them against logistics targets within Russia. Targets that, until recently, were untouchable. With a range of up to 300 kilometers, ATACMS are perfect for reaching fuel deposits, railways, communication centers, and logistics installations in Russian territory. Even some regions around Moscow are technically within the range zone. Yes, you heard right. Moscow is no longer totally out of risk. A bold, dangerous movement that can redefine the next chapters of this conflict that has lasted more than 2 years. And if you think you've seen enough, wait until you hear about the next step. The Taurus missile, the most accurate, most destructive, and most feared of all. Germany is about to release it. What does that mean? What will be Russia's answer? And how far can this war climb? Stay with me, because in the next block, things will be even more serious. And now we enter the most delicate phase and, perhaps, the riskiest of this military climbing. The next big step is called Taurus, a cruise missile made in Germany with range between 500 and 700 kilometers, capable of with profoundly buried targets, such as bunkers, underground command centers, and fortified military bases. For months, Berlin resisted Kiev's pressure to provide this weaponry. The fear was obvious. Taurus is considered one of the most lethal weapons in the European arsenal, with the potential to cause significant damage to strategic regions within Russia. But Germany's patience seems to have come to an end. Recent statements make it clear that the delivery of Taurus is imminent. Internal sources of the German government have revealed that the final discussions have already been made and that, very soon, the first units will be on their way to Ukraine. For Kremlin, this represents a maximum warning signal. After all, with such reach, virtually no Russian military installation is safe. Moscow, St. Petersburg, missile launch centers, strategic air bases, all this becomes potential target. The concept behind the release of these missiles is simple: to give Ukraine the much-desired strategic depth. This means that instead of just waiting to be attacked, Kyiv will now have the ability to neutralize long-range targets even before any threat crosses his border. Weapons deposits, logistics centers, bombing aircraft hangars, drone factories, all of these locations are technically on the possible target list. On the Russian side, the reaction came immediately. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov spared no words. In an indignant tone, he stated that these new permissions granted by the West represent a dangerous and unprecedented climbing. Peskov made it clear that Moscow considers these actions as a direct threat to Russia's national security. More than that, he has warned that Kremlin can, from now on, consider new retaliation targets, including outside the Ukrainian territory. Russian diplomacy raised tone in the last conferences. In an emergency pronouncement, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Moscow is reviewing his military doctrine to respond in asymmetrically and unexpected if Ukrainian attacks with Western armament reach the interior of Russia. International analysts began to speculate about what exactly Lavrov meant by that. Was it a veiled threat of cyber attacks, sabotage, or even the use of weapons of greater destructive power? Meanwhile, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France maintain the stance that the supply of these missiles is a legitimate response to Russian aggression. According to the German government, Ukraine is simply exercising its right to self-defense, provided for in the United Nations Charter. The central argument is that Moscow violated all possible diplomatic lines with recent mass attacks against Ukrainian cities. Behind the scenes, however, sources of European and American intelligence admit that the situation is moving towards dangerous territory. The fear that Russia will consider some kind of response outside Ukraine already begins to circulate in the NATO corridors. Baltic countries, Poland, Romania, and even Germany began revisions from their own defense plans. After all, a Russian attack on any territory of NATO would automatically activate Article 5 of the treaty, leading to a direct war between Russia and the Western Bloc. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, the mood is expectant. The Ukrainian government has been intensifying training for troops that will operate new missile systems. British and American military experts have been on Ukrainian soil for weeks, offering technical and tactical support to maximize the impact of upcoming attacks. The targets are already mapped, the flight plans designed. And now, with Taurus in the play, Ukraine can aim at points that, until a few days ago, were considered unreachable. And as if all this was not enough, there is a detail that has been little commented on the international media. According to information leaked by military sources, Ukraine also studies the possibility of launching coordinated attacks, combining Storm Shadows, Atacms, and, in the future, Taurus. This would create an offensive of multiple vectors, making it difficult to make any efficient Russian air defense attempt as much as possible. If this really happens, we can watch in the coming weeks to a series of depth attacks that can change the course of war. The question that remains is, how will Moscow react when he realizes that, for the first time since the conflict, his strategic bases are under direct threat? And most importantly, what will be Russia's next step if Ukraine begins to consistently reach Russian soil? And now we come to the most sensitive and explosive point of this whole situation: the political and military developments of this change of posture of the West. The fact is that Russia historically has always responded to external pressures with unexpected and often disproportionate counterattacks. And from the moment Moscow realizes that their strategic centers are at real risk, the whole world begins to ask, what will be Putin's next movement? Shortly after the official announcement of the suspension of range restrictions, the Kremlin summoned an extraordinary meeting of the Russian Security Council. Sources linked to European intelligence claim that among the topics discussed were possible retaliation operations outside Ukraine. NATO's central concern at this time is that Moscow can choose to reach targets in countries that are providing weapons to Ukraine. A large-scale cyber attack? Sabotage? Or, in the worst scenario, a direct attack on some NATO military base in Europe? The truth is that no one knows for sure how far Kremlin is willing to go. On the other hand, the Ukrainian leadership follows in the speech that it will use the new missiles responsibly. President Volodymyr Zelensky himself said the attacks will be directed exclusively to legitimate military targets. According to him, Ukraine has no intention of attacking civilians or performing actions that can be considered provocative beyond the necessary. But the problem is that in a conflict of this magnitude, the line between a legitimate military target and an intolerable provocation can be extremely thin, especially in Moscow's eyes. Meanwhile, at NATO, concern for climbing is visible. Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of the alliance, stated that NATO members are ready for any scenario, but stressed that the main objective is still to avoid direct war with Russia. However, he also made it clear that if a country member of the alliance is attacked, the answer will be immediate and proportional. This puts the world in a state of maximum warning, something that has not been seen since the Cold War. Another factor that further increases the tension is the nuclear rhetoric coming from Moscow. In recent days, high-ranking figures of the Russian government have again failed to mention the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons if they feel that Russia's territorial security is at existential risk. For many analysts, this is just a bluff, but for others, it is a sign that Kremlin is really considering all options on the table. In addition, the movement of Russian troops near borders with the Baltic countries and Poland has generated apprehension. Satellite images show unusual displacements of heavy artillery equipment, anti-aircraft systems, and medium-range missile batteries. Defense experts interpret this as an attempt to dissuade any bolder action by Ukraine and NATO. While all this happens, the Russian population also begins to feel the psychological effects of the new phase of war. For the first time, the possibility that Ukrainian missiles reach Russian soil is treated as a real threat. In Moscow, local authorities started civil defense exercises, simulating air attacks. Schools are reviewing their evacuation plans, and anti-aircraft shelters that have been closed for decades have been reopened. On the Ukrainian side, the feeling is that this is a window of opportunity that may not be repeated. The possibility of weakening Russian logistics, reducing Moscow's offensive capacity, and even forcing Kremlin to rethink its general strategy is seen as a crucial step for the country's future. Ukrainian military personnel are already working with target lists, and analysts say the first large long-range attacks can happen at any time. Now the question that hangs in the air is, will Russia accept this new reality without dramatically reacting? Or are we on the verge of a climb that can involve countries hitherto distant from the front line? The answer, unfortunately, may come in the coming days, or even in the next few hours. The fact is that the world is watching one of the most dangerous moments since the beginning of the war. The rules of the game were broken, the boundaries of range were knocked down, and from now on, what was once considered impossible, it has become a matter of time. How far will all this go? Only the time and the next explosions in Moscow radars will say.